So aquatic biomes also are based around their abiotic factors, but there's a number of ways in which those factors are different in the way they apply to aquatic biomes than they do the ones on land. Most of them are the same type of biomes, with the exception maybe of like pH or something like that. It's almost strictly a water property. But a lot of them are not limiting factors are in short supply like they are on land, and vice versa. So we'll go ahead and go through a couple to show you what I mean. Obviously, the number one limiting factor on land, what is the number one limiting factor on land? Let me put it that way. Rain or precipitation, water level, water availability, right? So that's what makes the desert a desert, a grassland, and so on. That's not going to be a limiting factor in the ocean, right, or in a lake. Wetlands, yes. If a wetland stays too dry, just stays dry for too long, it should flood every year. If it doesn't, couple seasons sometimes it takes, but it'll kill it. Or if it gets too much, then and it stays flooded, it will no longer be a wetland. A lot of the species that are there that need to be immersed or drained will die off, and it'll change into a different ecosystem. So, but otherwise, in the open ocean or in a coral reef or in a lake or something like that, the water obviously is not going to be a limiting factor. One thing that is a limiting factor in aquatic ecosystems that is, for the most part, not on land is oxygen. Because as you know, we have about how much oxygen in the atmosphere, percentage-wise? About 20%, right? You guys should know that. You should memorize that. About 20% oxygen in the atmosphere. That's more than enough for any respiring organism to survive on land. Now, sometimes it will become a limiting factor as you go higher in elevation, but usually by the time the low oxygen hits you, you've also been limited severely by how cold it is. But for the most part, there's always plenty of oxygen. That organisms don't have to worry about that. However, in the water, it has to be dissolved, and the water does not really hold that much oxygen. So in many aquatic ecosystems, it is a limiting factor. We also saw this, if you remember, when we talked about water pollution and how organic waste will cause the oxygen levels to drop, and only certain things will survive through that. That means that oxygen has become a limiting factor. So that's another thing that's different between land and sea. And temperature is much less of a factor. Okay? Because water has a way of regulating temperature. And it can get almost as warm. I'm not sure what the highest sea surface temperatures are, but I know that they can get into the 90s in some areas. The highest recorded land temperature, I believe, was 127 or somewhere around there in Death Valley. But the real big difference is in how cold things can get. Seawater will not freeze because of the pressure. We've talked about that particular property of water that has to expand to freeze. And so its minimum temperature is going to be around 4 degrees Celsius, which is like 39 or something like that, 38 Fahrenheit. So it's not going to get anywhere near as cold on land. It can get down to negative 170, I believe, was the lowest recorded temperature. So obviously a big difference there. Okay. Water chemistry is something that is going to be an issue. Salinity, pH, dissolved oxygen, amounts of various nutrients, iron, all those other kind of things that are dissolved in the water, that can vary quite a bit. And so that's going to be more of those things are going to have more of an effect in an aquatic ecosystem. Salinity, maybe a little bit sunlight, not really so much substrate temperature. Definitely, well, it does affect pressure. Nah. Depth is another prime abiotic factor in an aquatic ecosystem, is how deep it is. Because like it says there, it's going to affect how much sunlight penetration you get. In the ocean, you hit a point at about 1,500 meters deep where it's complete blackout. So that, of course, is going to have a big effect on what kind of organisms exist there. Also, you have effective temperature, of course, so it's going to be hotter at the top, cooler as you go down. And then pressure, obviously, and it gets, of course, extremely high levels of pressure in the deep ocean. Organisms have to be adapted to that. And as a matter of fact, if you bring those organisms up too fast, you will kill them. They won't explode or anything, but it will cause cellular changes that ends up killing them. Saltwater life zones. Now, instead of biomes, they like to use the term life zones. If we start from the shore going out, you first hit the intertidal zone. That's the area between the high water mark and the low water mark, high tide and low tide. In Florida, the way you can tell, or what you see there, is typically you'll see on the beach, you'll see the seaweed and stuff that washes up in that area. Because we have sandy beaches. So you can't really see much of a difference or much of a intertidal community in areas that have sandy beaches. But in areas where they have a rocky coastline, you have a wide variety of organisms that develop and live in these areas. And when the water recedes back, those rocks and stuff will hold the water there and form intertidal pools. And those happen to be very biodiverse environments that you find there. You can find lots of clams and other kinds of bivalves and sponges and anemones and crabs and other kinds of things like that, organisms like that. So that's an intertidal zone. Unfortunately, like I said, we don't get a lot of those here because they are pretty neat places to look at. Things in that area, they have to be adapted to the fact that they are underwater part of the time and exposed or semi-exposed another part of the time on a day-by-day basis. And also they have to be well adapted, root into the rocks or whatever well, or in the case of, for example, crabs, they're pinchers. You wonder what do you think crabs pinchers are for? What do they use it for?
Grabbing on the rocks.
Holding on to the rocks. Now, granted, they do use it for their food and stuff, and they use it defensively, etc. But the main adaptation that it's for is holding them in place when the waves come crashing in and things like that, or you have high currents in other areas like that. That's primarily why they have that particular adaptation. They have very strong. Anybody ever been pinched by a crab?
Yeah.
Yeah. They pinch pretty hard. So that's an adaptation that those have. Then you have the neritic zone, basically, that goes from the low tide mark all the way out to the edge of the continental shelf. Okay. That is, this is going to be a very biodiverse, this is actually the most biodiverse area of the ocean, diverse, for a couple reasons. Number one, you have areas, this is about the only place in the ocean where you're going to have sunlight penetrate down to the bottom. So you can have producers and like coral and kelp plants and seagrasses and stuff that can be rooted into the bottom and still get enough sunlight to grow. So that's an important factor. They also get a lot of sediment is good. I'll take that. This is where they get it from. They get a lot of nutrients in the sediments from the runoff from rivers, because of course the rivers drain across the land, empty out into the ocean, and that's actually where your continental shelf comes from. It's from the constant erosion and deposition of sediments as the water drains off the land and empties out into the ocean, takes sediments with it, and those are deposited, and they have built up that shelf there over the years. That's also why, since many of these sediments and things are organic, they have fish waste and everything else in them, why the continental shelf is a particularly good area to mine for petroleum and natural gas. Because, because over the millions of years, those organic sediments have descended and compressed and everything else like that and formed deposits there. Yeah, so that explains why that area is so biodiverse. Any questions? Aquatic life zones so far?
Okay.
All right, so just like we did, but to a lesser extent with how we did the tropical, temperate, polar. Please don't make me go through the hand motions again. But not so much polar, but you can also do that designation with your aquatic life zones. The reason why it's not as much of a distinction, of course, is because of the fact that ocean currents and everything reduce the amount of difference in temperature between the latitudes. You know, as your ocean currents go up from the equator, carry the heat energy up towards the northern and southern latitudes, that's going to make it, of course, so there's less temperature difference between them. So, but you do have some differences. You have your tropical neritic life zones, and the primary ones in there are your coral reefs and grass beds, seagrass beds. Okay, and we've talked a bit about those, so I'm not going to go into details about well, not the seagrass bed so much, but just in general. If you've ever seen like turtle grass and stuff like that, it is a submersed. It's actually a flowering, which is very rare in aquatic plants. Most of them are not that developed, but it is a flowering species, and the pollen and everything is transferred through the water. And it is common in shallow and warmer areas, and it's pretty productive. Turtles like it. Turtles like to eat that. Manatees as well are a big fan of the grass beds, and they're very good also for water clarity, for holding and keeping nutrients and everything in place. Then, of course, coral reefs. We've gone on quite a bit about those. They are, once again, your most biodiverse and productive per cubic meter ecosystem on Earth. The human impact for these are just basically, a lot of it has to do with access. You know, these are areas where people have to go through to get to land. So historically, you've had a lot of dredging operations and things like that in order to put ports in as ships got bigger and bigger. You also, of course, the fishing pressure has been the most in those areas. Historically, you know, we've just really started in the past century going out into the open ocean to do a lot of the fishing. So these areas have been overfished quite a bit. And as you know, and we talked about this when we talked about water pollution, the main source of water pollution in the ocean is runoff from the coastal areas, and therefore these particular areas, being your coastal life zones, they're going to receive the most of that. And sediment as well. You know, sediment technically is a type of pollution, but this is that sediment, of course. Now, the sediment is good. The organisms do need that for nutrients, but it's also bad if you get too much of it. It doesn't have time to settle because it does, the water clarity, of course, goes, and that, of course, is going to cut back the sunlight, and it can clog the gills of fish and benthic organisms and other kinds of things. So that's not a good thing. And a decrease in salinity due to water diversion. Now, to understand this, you have to remember why oceans are salty in the first place. And the fact that the water, as it goes and precipitates from the water cycle and runs off across the land as it goes along, it picks up dissolved ions. So when you start off with water at what they call the headwaters, usually up in mountains and things, it's at its freshest or purest state with the least amount of dissolved substances, and it picks up more and more as it goes downstream, eventually to the ocean. And you have this area in there. Where is it? Did we get to talk about it yet? Okay, we'll get to it. But it's an estuary. Hopefully I didn't give you an answer. But an estuary is the area where that water, the fresh water, meets the ocean. By then it's semi-salty, but then in the estuary, it will also, the tides will bring salt water from the ocean into the estuary, and under other conditions, water from the runoff will push it out. So you have varying levels of salinity, but salinity is a big deal as an abiotic factor with a lot of marine organisms. So when we do water diversion, when we do things like dig canals and things to drain the land, or to use for agriculture and other kinds of things like that, we tend to increase the amount of water runoff that comes through and doesn't have a time to filter through the land, and therefore is not as salty. And so that is a negative effect on many organisms having lower salinity levels. In particular, corals are very sensitive animals to organisms to both temperature and salinity. And when they have variations in those factors, one of the things that they do is they will kick out the algae that's living inside of them. For some reason, scientists are not really sure exactly what function that serves to do that, because they need that algae. But when they do that, and there'll be a time period, I'm not sure how long, but there'll be a little while the coral is still alive, that it's colorless. So they call it bleaching, because the algae is what gives coral its color, the little algae cells inside the coral. But then, of course, without that algae food source, and coral does eat other stuff, they're filter feeders, so they can survive for a little while, but typically after, I don't know, like I said, I don't know the time period, but they will die eventually if they don't reabsorb some algae to do that. So that's coral bleaching. Any questions about the tropical type life zones, aquatic life zones? All right, then you have the more temperate type, colder water. Kelp forests are the main thing you'll find in these. Benthic? Well, Benthic's not a life zone, so...
A for effort?
Yeah. Trying to think, no, because they're not strictly benthic. They extend all the way up to the surface of the water, so that wouldn't be accurate either. Temperate. That's what we're looking for here. So in the colder water areas, higher and lower latitudes, you find these. These are the kelp, of course. It's a big, long, they look like big wide blades of grass. They're actually a type of algae, multicellular algae. And they do root to the bottom. They don't have true roots though, because they're not a higher level plant, but they have what they call holdfasts that hold on to the bottom. And they're very productive. One of the reasons why they're very productive is because the cold water means that they hold more what's when it comes to things that stuff need in the ocean. What factor? Oxygen is correct. Very good. So therefore that helps to make them very productive, and because of their high levels of productivity, a lot of fishing has been done, and overfishing in many cases in these particular areas. And since you have highly productive and ecosystems. Nah. This is where you find most of your marine mammals, your whales. Dolphins are somewhat tropical, but most of your whales spend much of their time in this is where they do their feeding. They'll go to tropical areas to reproduce, raise their young, and then they'll migrate back up into the more temperate areas because of the higher oxygen levels, more plankton surviving there. And so they're common there, and of course we have done a lot of damage to those species through whaling and things like this. This also includes seals and stuff like that. Otters, you may know the story of that, how they were hunted near extinction for their pelts, and then because of that the urchins grew out of control, and the urchins ate the kelp, et cetera, so they were deemed as a keystone species. But that's just another example of how overfishing, overharvesting, obviously an otter's not a fish, but or whales, but overharvesting from these areas have caused the environmental impact that we've had there. All right, then you have your open ocean. There's a lot of different divisions in here. I'm not going to go into all that, so you don't have to worry about learning that. But you have basically a photic zone, which means a zone where you have what?
Sunlight.
Yeah, light. So sunlight penetrates to certain depths. In general, you can go down about 200 meters, and you hit what they call a twilight zone, where there's maybe like 10% of the sunlight is left penetrating down. Then you go down 15 to 1,500 meters, or 4,500 feet deep, and past that, it's complete darkness. So that obviously means that they're not going to be able to rely upon, in those lower depths, they're not going to be able to rely upon photosynthesis or photosynthetic organisms like plankton. By the way, make sure you put in here in your notes phytoplankton. Okay. So they have to rely upon marine snow is correct. Although I hate that term. When I was growing up, we learned the real name for this. I'm gonna give you the points because that's accurate. That's what they use nowadays. Detritus.
Somebody agreed with that.
Yeah, it does. Probably wrong. Fish poop and other organic waste.
Oh, not food.
Yeah. Everything that's growing up in the upper levels has to sink down, And although it's very low in density, primary productivity is usually measured on a per square meter or cubic meter basis. So for the open ocean, it's actually very low in density of producers in photosynthesis. But of course, it's the ocean, so there's a huge amount of it, and therefore the greatest number, the highest biomass of producers is phytoplankton in the open ocean, and also most of the world's oxygen is produced by this phytoplankton as well, and tremendous amounts of carbon dioxide are also absorbed by it. So, any questions?
No.
Okay, freshwater. So we talked about marine life zones. Now we'll talk a little bit about freshwater life zones. We've actually talked about this quite a bit because these, of course, are the main recipients of pollution. Of course, pollution does affect the marine ecosystem, particularly the coastal ecosystems, but the freshwater ecosystems, of course, get the brunt of it because it's mostly produced on land, precipitates down there, washes off, etc. So they're going to get the highest concentrations, and they don't have the benefit of dilution, because as a professor once said to me, the solution to pollution is dilution. So these type of water systems have suffered mostly from that, as well as certain other things, particularly wetlands have been altered by water diversion, primarily something called dredge and fill, where you can take a wetland area and dig canals into it, and then the dirt that you dig up, you pile up on the sides, and that means then that the water, rather than spreading out over the land, will sink down into that canal, and you make the canal at enough of a grade that it will drain, and you drain that out into the ocean. That's how Miami was made, basically. Prior to the 1920s, there was maybe a mile-wide strip of barrier land that went along the east coast of Florida down to the Keys, and everything else was the Everglades. It encroached all the way up to, like I said, about a mile from the ocean, actually. In that time period, though, Henry Flagler, I don't want to go deeply into the history of it, but one of the things they did was they dug deep canals and drained that whole area, and it had some severe effects on the, there used to be coral reefs that would go up towards, up to Fort Pierce. They're no longer there, and that's one of the reasons why, from all this, the pollution and everything, and the change in the salinity, and all the different factors that altered, have had a lot of effect. Bless you. Then you can, or filled group 5, can you be more, can you explain that more? What do you mean by filled?
Like the water fills it.
It's the same word.
I think I know what you're saying.
Yeah,
Hopefully I'm going to be maybe a little, so the opposite of drained is flooded, which is filled up over the top. So wetlands have to be dry part of the year, and they have to be flooded part of the year. But in this case, it means they stay flooded more than a couple of seasons, and that will kill them basically, or change them into water. Yeah, dredge is correct. That's to dig out. The fill part is when you take what's dug out and you pile it up on the sides and bring up the level of the land, so it's not a wetland anymore. Salinity dynamics. Yeah, this is the one I gave you guys in estuaries. I knew this was an answer later. Have been impacted quite a bit by these kind of dredge and fill projects, by the fact that you are altering the amount of natural runoff. That's going to alter salinity levels and things like that. So those are some of the main ways in which these types of freshwater ecosystems. I didn't spend a lot of time on this because we've already talked about the main one quite a bit when we talked about cultural what? Eutrophication. So that's the main way in which we've affected freshwater aquatic ecosystems. Freshwater aquatic ecosystems do go through an aquatic succession similar to what happens on land, and in the way that they're similar to it is based around the buildup of nutrients, although it's not all in the soil, or what they call the hydrosoil, what you would call muck in a lake. But that is what happens. They build up over time. It gets thicker and thicker. If that lake or body of water does not have flow through it, like if it's not a lake that is just part of a widening of a river, or it doesn't have a spring, then eventually that lake will fill in. Now, it may take thousands of years, but it will get more and more shallow, shallower, and eventually become a wetland. The stages for this are oligotrophic, mesotrophic, and our old friend eutrophic, but this is a good eutrophic, not the bad eutrophic. This is one that nature does over thousands of years of time, and because of that slow input of nutrients, there's time for natural selection to produce a number of different species to utilize all the nutrients that are in those lakes. They're actually more biodiverse and more productive than what we usually think of lakes as being mesotrophic, and we don't get a lot of oligotrophic ones, but they're most productive. Although they don't have a lot of big fish because they're packed with stuff. But it's a healthy thing. There's a lot of stuff in there, not like you have with a cultural or artificial eutrophication, where it happens in some cases overnight, and in that same case, the algae and the bacteria bloom out of control overnight. Now, you could make the argument that maybe 1,000 years from now, those culturally eutrophic lakes will eventually become like naturally eutrophic lakes, but we don't like, people don't like to look at that time span and have to deal with that. Fish are a renewable resource. Is one of the few food types that we still get from the wild primarily. Because it's renewable, there are sustainable techniques and unsustainable techniques. And just like we saw with forests, it's not just about how much you take out, but it is about how you take it out. So one of the most destructive and least sustainable types of techniques is something called bottom trawling, where they drag a heavy weight behind the boat with a net that floats up above it. And so they're basically, not only are they taking huge amounts of fish and other organisms when they do that, they are destroying the bottom and destroying that benthic habitat when they do that as well. And that's huge. That's actually been outlawed in most fishing areas of developed nations, but it still goes on in a lot of other parts of the world. Net fishing in general is going to end up bringing in a lot of stuff that you don't need. That the fishing people don't want. That's known as bycatch. And granted, they throw these back, but a lot of them are killed in the process. And in particular, there's certain particular organisms that are going to be most sensitive to this. Any ideas? Those ones would be most affected by being caught in nets and being released, but a lot of times it's too late. Dolphins, mammals, manatees, also mammals.
Manatees are in the ocean.
How about
Sharks.
not so much. We look for things that don't have gills.
So essentially,
Turtles,
underground.
things that need to, of course, get to the surface and breathe, so they get tangled up. There's a good chance they'll get held submersed for a long period of time, and of course they'll drown. So whenever you fish with nets, that's going to be a big problem. Also, one way, of course, to regulate these kind of fishing and stuff as renewable resources, to specify certain species when they're under pressure to not be taken, and also size. Why would it be better to take large fish out of a population? Yeah, Judy?
So the others can grow, the smaller ones can
Grow and
up,
do what?
reproduce.
There you go. So when you got your older fish, they are past their reproductive prime. They're basically just taking things out of the resources and not allowing the younger fish to reproduce as much and therefore repopulate. So like I said, they are renewable, so theoretically, if you stick to the bigger fish and don't take too many of them out, then you will have another group of fish next year to catch every year. But if you go excessively, or you catch ones that are too small and everything, that's not going to happen. So as you might imagine, these rules and regulations are hard to enforce in international waters. All right, excuse me. Finally, we have aquaculture, and that's when you raise in a controlled environment like agriculture any kind of aquatic organism. Sometimes they're plants, sometimes they're shellfish, sometimes they're fish, nectons to be exact. Although this seems good because it's going to reduce the pressure on your wild populations, they have all the environmental impacts before. A lot of habitat destruction has happened from this type of industry, particularly in mangrove swamp areas around the world, where they've cleared these areas out because they don't put a fish farm in the middle of a field somewhere. They put them usually in coastal areas. They go right offshore, and they basically build like a fenced-in or caged area to keep the fish in. And so it's still permitted, please. And so consequently, the fish poop, the fish diseases, excuse me, can all get out in the water. Any questions?
You alright?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Destruction of coastal habitats. And genetic contamination. So just like we talked about with other agriculture, if the tame stock gets out into the wild population, it's going to weaken them. Seniors may go.